A 7 1/4 inch gauge Sweet William steam locomotive, part 13. Countersinking the mounting holes in the pieces of steel angle and painting the parts ready for bolting them in place inside the frames. If you've been following the series, then you will know that these parts are going to be used to support the boiler in the frames. These boiler mountings, which are now much modified, were originally held in place using 7 2BA bolts. The problem was that the nuts on the end of the bolts actually fouled the nuts on the 4 1/4 inch bolts that held the boiler in place. Now that these mountings are more complicated, incorporating an expansion mechanism, I don't want to use ordinary nuts and bolts. Instead, I'm going to use 2BA countersunk bolts. Today I will be driving over to West Yorkshire, so I'll call in at Blackgates Engineering and have a look what they have. Many years ago, in 1996 to be accurate, I bought these countersunk 2BA bolts, which are the Allen key type. These are the only two that I have left. I'll see if they have any more. Before I can fit countersunk bolts, I need to countersink the angles. This countersink bit was only just long enough. I was holding it in the drill chuck by the very last 1/4 inch of the shank. Thankfully it was just enough, and here I'm countersinking the steel angles. After countersinking the first one, I set the depth stop on the drilling machine so that all the countersinks were exactly the same size. When I'm drilling pieces of steel, I seldom hold them in my hands, but as countersink bits don't seem to grab like twist drills, this seemed to be a quick and simple way of doing the job. Time for a bit of painting, or should I rephrase that, time for quite a lot of painting. Previously the parts were coated in etching primer, now it's time for the top coat. The black paint that I'm using is the usual HMG Paints C71 Satin Black. Here I'm painting the top side of the mountings, and as shown previously with the etching primer, I wiped off part of the paintwork. Because the parts of these mountings with the slots in them are bearing surfaces, and once assembled the mechanism will securely anchor the boiler to the frames but allow it to contract and expand. I was going to fit the smoke box today, but then I realised how bad the paintwork was on the smoke box saddle, so I thought it would be a good idea to give it a couple of coats of paint. Here's the first one. Another good thing about this HMG Satin Black is you can brush paint it as well. Just spray some into the aerosol cap, find a suitable paintbrush and off you go. This is enamel paint, it is not cellulose, so it brushes very well. I've touched some of the copper piping, but that's not a problem because I'll probably end up removing it to clean it anyway. This paint takes a bit longer to dry than cellulose paint, but I don't mind because it's such good stuff to use. On the scale of shininess of satin black paint, I find this one to be a bit closer to matte than to gloss. Also, the heat resistant properties are quite good. That is, provided that in the first couple of test steamings you don't get the smoke box too hot. After a couple of gentle steamings to bake on the paint, then it's the time to do the proper steam test and raise the whole thing to a much higher temperature. It's worth mentioning at this stage that if any of the paintwork does bubble, don't touch it, just leave it. It will go back when the boiler cools. If you touch hot and bubbling paintwork with a cloth, you really have lost. The paintwork will stick to the cloth, and when you remove the cloth, you'll remove the paint. So just leave it to go back on its own. As well as painting the smoke box saddle, I'm also painting this bit in the centre, which supports the front of the tanks. Please note all of these parts will need 2 coats of paint, but for the purposes of the video, I'm only going to show 1. Here it's not looking too good, but that's because the paint hasn't dried yet. The paint hasn't dried on the boiler mountings either, that's why they're so shiny. It will eventually go quite dull. You may be wondering why I'm painting on the workbench in the main workshop and not in the outer part of the workshop near the open door. This is for two reasons. One is, on the bench in the outer part of the workshop is the smoke box and chimney assembly. And the chassis is so big and heavy, it's a bit too much for me these days to carry it from the workshop into the outer part of the workshop. When I initially painted the smoke box and chimney assembly, I left the fittings in place and masked them. Then I thought better of it and removed them. This is the hole at the bottom of the smoke box where the blast pipe goes through. There's a fairly unnecessary brass fitting that goes into this hole. This fitting needs a surprising amount of attention and the blast pipe needs modification. I'll show that in the next video. The final part to paint in this episode is the smoke box door. The paint's not in too bad condition. I scoured it with some Scotch-Brite just to provide a key for this coat of paint. I don't see the point in removing paint if it's more or less okay. It's often best to paint the entire unit than use a small paintbrush touching in the damage. This paint covers beautifully and it doesn't run very much. Well, it does if you put too much on. And here it's borderline in places, but it will be fine. And don't forget, this is HMG paint, satin black. It's an enamel paint and it will not dry this shiny. It looks like it's got a big curved mark on it, but that is the reflection of a wire that hangs down from the ceiling and supplies mains to my tools on the bench, as well as a small compressor that you can see under the bench. That is it for this episode. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thanks for watching and I hope you found it useful. Please take the time to visit my Mainsteam Models website and click on the section of the website that says Video Playlists. And by doing that, you can find other videos that you may like to watch. And by using the playlists, you can actually watch the videos back to back.